When my mother died, I didn't cry. I calculated. Numbers, percentages, deadlines. The house where she had raised us was about to belong to the bank, and with it would go everything that was left of our family. I did what I thought was right, changed a few words, traced a signature. Not for money, for memory, for us. But if I had known that doing so would silence her voice forever, maybe I would have chosen empty walls instead of an empty heart. If this story resonated with your soul, click subscribe and let me know in the comments which city or country you're listening from. I'm truly curious to know where you're tuning in from. My name was Sarah Blaine. I was 41 years old when the ground beneath my life began to crack. I lived in northern Vermont, in a 2-story clapboard house with peeling white paint and hydrangeas that refused to bloom. The kind of house that held memory in its walls. It had been in our family since before I was born, passed down like a fragile heirloom too precious to sell, but too old to shine. It was the house I grew up in, where my mother taught me how to bake cornbread, and where my sister, Lily, broke her arm falling off the porch swing. It was where we celebrated birthdays, mourned deaths, and tried to hold ourselves together. I lived there still, long after I thought I'd be gone. Long after I imagined myself somewhere else. Maybe a city apartment with hardwood floors and a life full of noise and forward motion. But life has a way of turning us toward gravity, and in my case, gravity looked like illness, responsibility, and the quiet erosion of options. After my mother's first stroke, I moved back in to care for her. At first, it was temporary, just until she got stronger, just until Lily could sort herself out. But temporary turned into permanent, weeks into months, months into years. And suddenly, the girl who dreamed of art school and subways and noisy cafes had become the woman who knew the names of every pill in the cabinet and how to bathe an adult without shaming her. I worked as a paralegal at a small-town law office. Nothing glamorous. I reviewed contracts, filed forms, chased down signatures. My desk was always clean, my handwriting precise. I wasn't ambitious, not anymore. I was dependable. That was my gift. I showed up. I remembered things. I never made mistakes. That's how I thought of myself, someone who could be trusted to hold what others dropped. I had a son, Michael, 16 and already taller than me. He lived with his father in New Hampshire, but visited some weekends, and when he did, the house filled with the sound of video games and cereal bowls clinking in the sink. I missed him constantly, but I told myself I was doing the right thing by letting him live in a house where there wasn't the shadow of sickness in every corner. My younger sister Lily lived 2 towns over, though lived felt like too generous a word. She floated from job to job, boyfriend to boyfriend, always one step behind stability. She called me when her electricity was shut off or when she needed someone to remind her where she left her purse. I didn't resent her, not exactly. I just learned not to expect anything. My days were built from repetition. I woke up early, made coffee, checked on my mother, went to work, came home, cooked, cleaned, listened to her stories, even the ones she forgot she'd already told. I paid bills, answered calls, kept lists. I rarely looked in the mirror long enough to notice how tired I looked, but inside that routine lived a quiet fear I didn't name, a fear of what would happen when she was gone, of what would be left of us, of this house, of this family when the anchor finally gave out. The house itself had become a character in our lives, stubborn and weary. The roof leaked in the corner of the attic. The basement flooded every spring. The heating system wheezed like an old man with bad lungs. And still, I fought to keep it. I paid the mortgage every month, even when it meant skipping dinner or borrowing from my own credit. I didn't tell Lily. I didn't tell Michael. I didn't tell anyone how close we were to losing it. The debts piled slowly, like snow. You don't notice the weight until the roof caves in. Hospital bills from the stroke, repairs we couldn't afford, legal fees from settling an old property dispute. My salary covered just enough to keep the lights on, but not enough to dig us out. Every time I thought I had caught up, another envelope arrived, thick and impersonal, with numbers I couldn't bear to look at. I used to dream of leaving, of packing a bag and getting on a bus with no return ticket. But then I'd see my mother asleep in her chair, a blanket over her knees, her fingers curled like she was still holding my childhood, and I'd stay. Again and again, I'd stay. Some nights I sat in the kitchen after she had gone to bed, the overhead light buzzing like a fly trapped in a jar, and I would run numbers on scraps of paper. What I owed, what we owned, what we could sell. The math never worked. The math never lied. The house was slipping away from me, inch by inch, and with it, everything I had left to believe in. There was no villain in this story, no dramatic betrayal, just years of quiet erosion, 1,000 small decisions that led me here, to a place where the walls I once leaned on felt ready to collapse. And yet, I clung to them, because this house wasn't just wood and nails. It was our history. It was my mother's hands in the garden, my father's initials carved into the garage door, my own laugh echoing through the hallways when I was still small enough to believe the world was safe. I knew something had to change, that we couldn't go on like this, but I also knew I couldn't let go. Not of the house, not of the past, not yet. And so I folded the bills and hid them in drawers. I told Lily everything was fine. I told Michael I was proud of him. I told myself I'd figure it out. But deep down, I knew that the foundation beneath me was already cracked, that the life I had so carefully maintained was not built to withstand what was coming. And still, I kept the lights on. I turned down the thermostat. I checked on my mother, who no longer remembered how we got here. I kissed her forehead and said goodnight. Outside, the wind picked up. The trees bent low, as if listening. The house creaked like it had something to say. But I wasn't ready to hear it. Not yet. It began with a sound, a soft mechanical click as the printer came to life on my desk. The hum of the machine filled the quiet office, steady and unremarkable, yet somehow it carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken thoughts. I watched the blank paper feed through the rollers and imagined words appearing on it that could change everything. I didn't know if I was trembling from fear or from the sense that I had already made the decision long before that moment. The first time I thought about doing it, it didn't feel real. It was a distant thought, a whisper at the edge of exhaustion. But like all forbidden things, it returned, stronger each time. I had been staring at numbers for weeks, the kind of numbers that don't lie and don't forgive. The bank had sent another notice, stamped with red ink, announcing foreclosure proceedings. The house my mother built, the house filled with her scent and her silence, was about to belong to someone else. I tried to imagine her ghost wandering through someone else's kitchen, her memories erased by a stranger's furniture. I couldn't bear it. At work, surrounded by contracts and wills, I knew too much. Knowledge can be its own kind of temptation. I knew what a valid signature looked like. I knew which phrases carried legal weight and which ones only sounded important. I knew that a signature was not a voice or a gesture. It was just ink, and ink could be replicated. I told myself I was only imagining it, a harmless thought. But imagination, once given a shape, doesn't easily fade. It begins to breathe, to whisper that it isn't so terrible, that it could make sense. I spent nights at the kitchen table with my mother's old notebook open before me, her handwriting looping softly across the pages. She had written grocery lists, recipes, reminders, little fragments of her world. I traced her letters with my finger, memorizing the slant, the pressure, the tiny tremor at the end of each Y. The thought of imitation made my stomach twist, but I couldn't look away. There was a storm that night. Rain pounded the roof, the kind that makes the house feel like a ship lost at sea. I sat there with the lamp casting yellow light over the page, and for the first time, I took out a blank sheet of legal stationery. The paper looked too clean, too expectant. My pen hovered above it, trembling slightly. I wrote her name once. It didn't look right. I tried again. The third time, it did. When the letters finally resembled hers, something inside me cracked and quieted at the same time. A strange calm washed over me, like the moment before diving underwater. It wasn't excitement. It wasn't relief. It was inevitability. I had crossed a boundary, though it didn't yet feel like one. It felt like survival. I drafted the will slowly, carefully, with all the precision my job had taught me. I wrote her full name, her date of birth, the address of the house, and then the clause, the one that would keep the house in my name. To my daughter, Sarah Blaine, who cared for me until my passing, I leave the residence at 14 Maple Lane. The words looked formal, sterile, and heartbreakingly logical. It was exactly what she would have wanted, I told myself. She had said it so many times, before her memory began to fray, before her voice grew small. I signed her name at the bottom, and beneath it, mine as a witness. My hands didn't shake. That frightened me more than anything. The next morning, the rain had stopped. The sky was the pale gray of surrender. I folded the paper, placed it in an envelope, and slipped it into my briefcase with the rest of my work files. My heart beat so loudly I thought it might echo through the hallway. But no one looked at me. No one ever did. At the office, the fluorescent lights hummed overhead, and the air smelled faintly of paper and toner. I walked past my colleagues, nodding, smiling, perfectly ordinary. My boss called out a good morning. I answered without stuttering. Every movement felt rehearsed, every gesture deliberate. I was the picture of composure, the model employee. No one could see the secret that pulsed beneath my skin. In the back room, where we stored client documents, I made copies. My hands moved automatically. Feed the paper, press the button, wait for the machine to breathe out its identical twin. I watched the ink dry and felt an odd detachment, as if I were observing someone else's crime. The hum of the copier blended with the rhythm of my heartbeat. That evening, I drove to the notary office. The small building sat behind a hardware store, the kind of place no one paid attention to. The clerk barely looked up. I handed over the envelope, pretending my hands weren't sweating. She stamped it, notarized it, slid it back to me with a bored smile. And just like that, it was done. Legal, sealed, real. When I drove home, the sun was setting, staining the sky the color of rust. The road shimmered with leftover rain, and for a moment I thought about turning around, tearing the papers apart, confessing everything. But I didn't. The weight of the envelope beside me was too heavy to let go of, too full of reasons and regrets that hadn't yet formed. That night I made tea and sat at the table where my mother used to sit. The house was quiet except for the ticking of the clock. I looked around at the photographs on the walls. Her holding me as a child, her standing in the garden, her smile unguarded and alive. I told myself I was protecting her memory, that I was saving what she built, that it was love that guided my hand. But love can be a dangerous alibi. As I stared at the papers lying neatly in front of me, The ink still faintly shining in the lamplight, I realized something had changed. The air felt heavier, the silence deeper. I couldn't explain it, but I felt her absence more sharply than ever before, as though in trying to keep her close, I had driven her farther away. I placed the forged will in the fireproof box beneath my bed, next to birth certificates and insurance papers. Then I turned off the light and lay awake, listening to the house creak under the weight of rainwater drying in the eaves. I had told myself it was a single act, one necessary deception to keep a home, a family, a legacy. But beneath the surface, something had already begun to shift. A seed planted in secrecy grows in silence, feeding on guilt until it becomes something unrecognizable. I didn't know it yet, but the line I crossed that night wasn't just ink on paper. It was a line carved deep inside me, invisible to the world, but one that would follow me everywhere I went. And in the faint light of dawn, when the first birds began to sing, I sat up, opened the drawer, and looked at the forged document one more time. It looked flawless, unquestionable, honest even. That was the most terrifying part of all. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, tucked between a grocery flyer and an electricity bill. It was thin, printed on government paper, and the words on the envelope made my stomach twist. Notice of investigation. I read it standing in the kitchen, still in my work clothes, the hum of the refrigerator filling the silence. My hands trembled as I unfolded the pages, the ink sharp and final. Someone had raised a question about my mother's will. Someone had noticed. At first, I tried to convince myself it was a misunderstanding, maybe a routine review, maybe an error. But the air in the room changed, heavy and electric, and somewhere deep inside, I already knew the truth had started to move, slowly like ice cracking underfoot. I didn't sleep that night. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, tracing the faint shadows that the streetlights threw across the plaster. Every sound of the house felt amplified. The ticking of the clock, the creak of wood, the faint drip of water from the kitchen faucet. It felt as though the house was breathing differently, as if it, too, knew something was coming. The next day, I drove to work as if nothing had changed. The road was the same trees, the same radio static between songs. But I could feel the world tilting, quietly, imperceptibly. My boss called me into his office that afternoon. There were two men in suits sitting there. They weren't smiling. They introduced themselves from the county legal department. Their voices were calm, measured, polite. They said they needed clarification about a document I had helped prepare, the one that bore my mother's signature. I couldn't breathe. My throat tightened. My answers came too quickly, too neatly. I told them everything was in order. I handed them copies, showed them the file, every letter, every stamp. They nodded, took notes, thanked me for my time. But one of them lingered. He looked at me for a moment longer than he needed to, the way someone looks when they already know the ending to your story. That night, I opened the box under my bed where I had hidden the original will. My hands shook as I unfolded it. The ink looked too dark now, too deliberate, the curves of my mother's name too precise, too careful. What had once seemed flawless now looked obscene. I imagined her looking over my shoulder as I wrote it, imagined her silence, cold, endless, disappointed. Weeks passed. The investigation became official. I received another letter, then another. The tone grew sharper. I was asked to come in for questioning. My sister, Lily, called me out of nowhere, her voice clipped, trembling. She asked if I had done something to the will. I denied it. I could hear her breathing, a long, low exhale of disbelief. When she hung up, the silence that followed was heavier than any accusation. The walls of my world began to close in. My coworkers whispered when I walked by. My boss avoided my eyes. Every time the phone rang, I jumped. I started drinking too much coffee, pacing the kitchen at night until dawn, my reflection in the window pale and hollow. I stopped answering the door. The house felt smaller each day, as though the walls were inching closer, stealing air. Then came the day they arrived. Two officers at my door, polite and efficient. They said my name, confirmed my address, handed me a warrant. The sound of the handcuffs locking around my wrists was so quiet it was almost tender. I didn't cry. I didn't fight. I just watched the world shrink through the narrow window of the police car as it pulled away from my house. The hydrangeas outside were finally blooming. I wondered if anyone would water them. The station was colder than I expected. They took my fingerprints, my photo, my jewelry. I sat in a gray room with no clock, staring at the table. Time lost meaning. The fluorescent lights buzzed above me like insects trapped behind glass. A woman came in, asked questions, her voice professional but not unkind. I answered, though each word felt like it belonged to someone else. When they told me I was being charged with forgery and fraud, my first thought wasn't of prison. It was of my mother, of her handwriting, of how I had studied it so carefully, the intimacy of imitation. The crime wasn't in the ink. It was in the love twisted into desperation. The trial didn't come for months, but the waiting was its own kind of punishment. I lost my job first, then my savings, then the few friends who still returned my calls. The house, our house, was seized as evidence. I moved through borrowed rooms, rented couches, temporary spaces that smelled of strangers and disinfectant. The newspapers printed my name once, briefly, in a column too small to matter. Local paralegal accused of forging mother's will. The letters formed a version of me I didn't recognize. The day of the sentencing was clear and sharp, the sky too blue for what was happening. The courtroom smelled of polished wood and old carpet. I sat very still as they read the verdict, my hands folded in my lap, the world narrowing to the sound of a gavel striking wood. Each word that followed was a hammer blow. Guilty, convicted, sentenced. It felt like falling without movement. When they took me away, the hallway outside the courtroom was long and echoing. My shoes clicked against the tile, a rhythm that didn't belong to me. I looked back once, half expecting to see Lily there, but she wasn't. No one was. The benches were empty, the air heavy with the dust of strangers' trials. The van ride to the correctional facility was silent except for the hum of the engine. I stared through the bars on the small window, watching the trees blur into green smears. I tried to count them, to anchor myself in something ordinary, but I lost track somewhere along the way. When we arrived, they told us to line up. The building loomed ahead, flat and sprawling, ringed with fences topped in silver wire that glinted like ice. The gates opened with a low groan. The smell of iron and bleach filled my lungs. Inside, the air felt different, thicker, slower, stripped of warmth. They handed me a uniform, a number, a pair of shoes that didn't fit. I changed under fluorescent light, my old clothes sealed in a plastic bag and carried away. The zipper's sound was final, like a door locking from the outside. As I walked down the corridor to my cell, the noise of the place pressed in from all sides, voices shouting, keys jingling, the sharp slam of metal against metal. I kept my eyes on the floor, counting the steps. The cell door shut behind me with a sound I felt in my bones. The world had shifted. It wasn't just a new place, it was a new planet. The air smelled of disinfectant and old fear. The walls hummed with the weight of too many stories. My name no longer mattered. My reasons didn't matter. All that existed was the routine, the repetition, the rules. I sat on the narrow bed, my hands in my lap, and for the first time, I understood what it meant to be erased while still breathing. In that moment, the life I had known, my job, my family, my house, even my own reflection, belonged to someone else, someone who had once believed that love could justify a lie. Now, in this other universe, the rules were simple. No explanations, no second chances, no forgiveness, only time, endless, indifferent time, and the quiet realization that I had crossed into a world from which I could never truly return. It's strange how quickly the unfamiliar becomes routine, how cold floors, plastic utensils, and numbered identities slide into place like a second skin. I used to think I would never adapt to prison. I used to think my guilt alone would consume me whole. But what no one tells you is that even grief becomes manageable when it's all you're given to carry. I stopped counting the days. They didn't belong to me anymore. Mornings began with a buzzer that shook the concrete walls. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like angry insects, and the cold metal of the toilet bowl kissed my skin before I was fully awake. I dressed in beige, ate in beige, spoke in beige. Color didn't live here, not in fabric, not in language, not in people. My cellmate Rosa taught me more about survival than any book or counselor ever could. She was short and wiry, with a laugh like a rusted hinge. She didn't ask questions, she watched. That was the first lesson. Watch more than you speak. I learned who to avoid, who to nod to in the corridor, which guards delighted in making you feel small. I learned how to fold my blanket just right for inspection, how to keep my head down during conflict, how to pretend I wasn't trembling when the shouting started. But adaptation wasn't the same as acceptance. My body went through the motions, but my mind refused to settle. I still thought about my house every night before sleep, the creak in the third stair, the way the wind sounded against the old shutters, the hum of the fridge that always ran too loud. I thought about my mother's hands, her rings, the faint citrus scent of her lotion. I thought about my sister and wondered what version of me she carried now, what stories she told herself to understand how we ended here. The letters stopped after the trial. I wrote anyway, pages filled with apologies, explanations, memories that couldn't be undone. I wrote to Michael, my son. I told him I was sorry, not just for what I'd done, but for every phone call I didn't answer, every birthday I spent working late. I never knew if he read them. I imagined him placing them in a drawer, unopened, or worse, dropping them straight into the trash. One morning, Rosa handed me a folded paper. It was a note from a new girl in the block, someone who'd heard I was the one who forged her own mother's will. I stared at the words, their cruelty sharpened by the fact that they weren't untrue. My crime wasn't one of desperation in the eyes of others. It was betrayal. It was unthinkable. That night, something shifted. I sat alone in the recreation yard, the chain link fence casting shadows like prison bars onto the cracked asphalt. The sky above was the only reminder that the world was still turning. Stars blinked, indifferent to my remorse. I tried to pray, though I didn't know what I believed in anymore. Not God, not justice, maybe time, maybe nothing. I remembered a moment from childhood, standing in our backyard during a thunderstorm, barefoot in the wet grass, my mother calling from the porch. I had refused to come inside, convinced that if I stood still enough, the sky would spare me. I had always thought that moment was about courage, but now, in this place, I saw it differently. It wasn't courage that kept me outside. It was pride, stubbornness, the belief that I could control what came next. Here, there was no control, only consequences. A week later, during group therapy, I finally spoke. Not much, just a sentence. I lied to save something that was already gone. The counselor looked at me as if I'd said something profound, but it didn't feel profound. It felt pathetic. Afterward, one of the women approached me, Tina, a mother of 3 doing time for embezzlement. She sat beside me in the mess hall and didn't ask questions, just placed half of her bread on my tray. In prison, that was as close to forgiveness as you got. I stopped writing after that, not because I gave up, but because I understood the silence on the other end. Some things break and stay broken. The point of no return wasn't a single moment. It was a collection of small ones. It was hearing the guard call me Blaine with no emotion. It was folding someone else's laundry for commissary credits. It was watching a woman cry herself to sleep and not having the strength to comfort her. It was realizing no one was coming to visit. Not this week, not next, maybe not ever. It was the first time I looked in the mirror and didn't recognize my own face, not because of how it changed, but because of how it didn't. I was still me, and that was the punishment. One evening, I was assigned to clean the administrative office after hours. It was quiet, the halls dim and humming with old electricity. As I wiped down the desk, I saw a folder with a familiar seal, the state legal department. For a moment, I froze. My name was on the label. I didn't open it. I didn't need to. My story wasn't a mystery anymore. It was cataloged, filed, reviewed, reduced to forms and summaries. What I had done, why it was wrong, what sentence had been handed down. Everything there but the part that mattered, the part where I had once loved someone enough to believe that the end justified the means. I returned to my cell that night and lay in the dark. Rosa snored softly in the bunk above. My mattress was thin, my body sore, my mouth dry. But my eyes stayed open, staring at the ceiling. There was no way back, no version of me that would emerge from this untouched. I would leave this place someday, yes, but I wouldn't return to the life I had before. That life was gone. I understood that now. This wasn't the bottom. This was the new floor, the place where I would learn how to keep breathing, even if no one remembered the sound of my name. It didn't come as a revelation, or a moment of clarity, or a hand reaching through the darkness. The beginning of light was smaller than that, barely visible, like a pinhole in a wall. I didn't notice it at first. I was too deep in routine, too tangled in silence. But light doesn't ask for permission. It slips in through the smallest cracks, and eventually you start to feel its presence before you ever see it. For me, it began with a library cart. Twice a week, a volunteer wheeled in a clunky metal cart stacked with donated books. Most of the women ignored it, already exhausted by the sameness of their days. But I found myself drawn to it, first out of boredom, then out of habit. One afternoon, I picked up a tattered paperback. No cover, yellowed pages, the spine cracked from too many hands. I didn't even look at the title. I just opened it and started to read. I don't remember the plot now. I only remember the feeling. The way the words pulled me out of the cinder block walls and into somewhere else. I read until my eyes blurred, until the lights flicked off, until Rosa yelled that I was going to ruin what little eyesight I had left. After that, I started volunteering in the library. It was nothing more than a repurposed office with metal shelves and a broken clock, but to me, it became a sanctuary. I organized books, repaired bindings with tape, wrote down overdue returns in a logbook that no one checked. It was quiet, and for the first time since arriving, I didn't feel invisible. I felt useful. The librarian was an older woman named Nadine. She had been volunteering at the prison for over a decade. She wore her hair in a tight bun and smelled like peppermint tea. She didn't ask questions about our charges or our time. She treated us like patrons, not inmates, and that small, consistent dignity, it mattered more than she probably knew. One afternoon, Nadine handed me a blank notebook and a pencil and said simply, "Write it down." I asked her what she meant. She said, "Whatever keeps you up at night." So I did. At first, it came out as fragments, sentences, images, the way my mother's hand looked wrapped around a mug, the smell of lemon cleaner in the kitchen, my sister's laugh in the hallway, the sound of the fire crackling during December storms, regret that didn't have words yet. Then it turned into letters, letters to people who would never read them, to Lily, to Michael, to my mother. I wrote about the things I'd done, and more painfully, the things I hadn't. I wrote the words I never said out loud. I'm sorry. I was scared. I thought I was doing the right thing. I don't know who I am anymore. Some days, the words stopped mid-page. Other days, I wrote until my hand ached and the pencil wore down to a nub. Nadine kept bringing me more. Eventually, I started sharing the notebook with a small writing group, 4 other women, all broken in their own ways, each of us holding shame like a second skin. We sat in plastic chairs once a week and read our words aloud. No one judged. No one flinched. There was a quiet agreement among us that we were more than what brought us here. One woman wrote poems about her daughter's hair. Another wrote a story in which she died and came back as a bird. I read pieces about the house, the will, the nights I spent tracing my mother's signature with trembling fingers. And the strangest thing happened. Someone cried. Not me, her. She said, "I get it." For the first time in so long, I didn't feel monstrous. I felt human. I applied for a prison education program and was accepted. It was basic, just GED prep and resume building, but it gave my days shape. I tutored other inmates in math, helped them write essays, practiced interview questions with them under buzzing ceiling lights. When one of them passed her exam, she hugged me so tightly I forgot where we were. The guards started calling me Miss Blaine. It wasn't kindness, but it wasn't cruelty either. It was distance with a hint of respect. Time softened. It didn't disappear, but it stopped cutting as sharply. I began to feel the seasons again, even through the narrow slit of my cell window. The way the sky changed from winter gray to spring blue. The way the air smelled slightly different in May. I was called into the counselor's office one morning. She told me my application for early release had been reviewed. There was a chance, a real one. She told me to keep my record clean, stay in the program, keep doing what I was doing. Afterward, I sat alone in the library and cried, not out of joy, but out of disbelief. I had stopped believing in hope a long time ago. I didn't know if I was ready to believe in it again. But that night, when I returned to my cell, Rosa left me a folded paper crane on my pillow. I didn't ask why. I just held it in my hand and stared at it. There are things in this world more fragile than paper. A mother's trust, a child's faith, a woman's memory of who she once was. But sometimes, even the fragile things survive. I wasn't whole, I wasn't healed, but I was changing. And somewhere deep in the center of me, a light had begun to glow. Weak at first, uncertain, but steady, like the first flicker of dawn after a long, endless night. They called it Release Day, but it didn't feel like freedom. I stood at the edge of the prison gates in clothes that didn't fit quite right. The jeans baggy, the shirt faded and unfamiliar. A guard handed me a plastic bag with my belongings. One photo, an old watch, a driver's license that no longer resembled the woman holding it. The sun was sharp, slicing through the morning chill, and for a moment I just stood there, squinting at the world I used to know. There was no welcome party, no balloons or hugs or tears of joy, just the distant hum of traffic and a bus stop down the road. I walked toward it slowly, my steps uneven, as if the earth had shifted in my absence. The halfway house sat in a sagging building 2 towns over, its paint peeling, its porch uneven. I shared a room with 2 other women, both newly released, both carrying their own silences. There were rules taped to the refrigerator: curfew at 9 p.m., no guests, chores assigned weekly. I didn't mind the rules. I understood them. They were lines on the floor in a world that still felt shapeless. The air outside smelled wrong. Too open, too fast, too loud. Cars honked. Dogs barked. People shouted into their phones. The world was overstimulated, vibrating at a frequency I no longer recognized. Crossing a street made my chest tighten. The green light didn't wait for me. I froze on the sidewalk more than once, unsure if I had the right to move. I spent the first weeks applying for jobs, walking door to door with a resume that told half a story and eyes that told the rest. I never lied, but I didn't always tell the truth. I've been out of the workforce for a few years. I took time off to care for a family member. I'm just looking for a fresh start. Some employers smiled and said they'd call. Most didn't. Eventually, I got a cleaning job at a strip mall bakery. Early mornings, hard floors, flour in the air. I swept, mopped, wiped down counters before the ovens warmed up. The manager didn't ask questions. She just handed me a schedule and a uniform that smelled like lemon cleaner. It wasn't glamorous, but it was honest. And after so many months of shadows, honesty felt like oxygen. I wrote to Michael again. Short letters, spaced apart. No pleas, no apologies, just updates. I'm working now. I live near a library. I planted basil in a plastic pot on the windowsill. He didn't answer. I didn't expect him to. Some days I walked through the neighborhood, past rows of houses with porches and bicycles and wind chimes dancing in the breeze. I imagined what my mother's house would look like now, if someone had painted the door, replaced the sagging gutters, dug up the garden where she used to plant tulips. I would never see it again. I tried to call my sister once. The line rang until it went quiet. I didn't leave a message. I didn't know what I would say. Freedom was not what I thought it would be. It was not a key in a lock or the absence of bars. It was a different kind of confinement, one built from memory, from shame, from the way people flinched when they heard the word felon. I kept my head down. I paid my rent. I folded my laundry neatly and kept my shoes by the door. I spoke little. I smiled when I was supposed to. Some nights I dreamed of courtrooms and paper and signatures that didn't belong to me. I'd wake up gasping, my hand curled around the edge of the mattress as if it might fall away. But other nights, I dreamed of softer things. My mother's voice calling me in from the rain, my son's laugh echoing down the hallway, the scent of vanilla in the kitchen on Sundays. One afternoon, I was asked to speak at a small community center, a program for women transitioning out of incarceration. The organizer had read a piece I'd written during my time inside. She asked if I would talk about rebuilding. I said yes, even though my hands trembled the whole week leading up to it. When I stood in that room, the walls painted a hopeful blue. I looked out at the faces of women like me, tired, tough, unbroken. I told them the truth, that some mistakes don't come with second chances, that some forgiveness never arrives, that rebuilding isn't about becoming who you were, it's about learning how to live with who you are. When I finished, a woman in the back stood up and said, "You made it." And for a moment, I let myself believe she was right. I rode the bus home in silence, the sky turning to honey outside the window. I pressed my hand to the glass and felt the vibration of the road beneath me, steady and real. Back in my room, I watered the basil and sat on the edge of the bed. I pulled out my notebook and wrote one line: "I am free and I am still afraid." But I kept writing, because fear, too, was part of freedom. And maybe, just maybe, so was hope.